To the special meeting.
Yes.
If you would, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Here we go.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you, folks. Welcome to those of you here and at home. Could we have a roll call, please?
Yes, Alderman Rucker.
Here.
Alderman Schuman. Here. Alderman Becker.
Here.
Alderman Osteen. Alderman Rose.
Here.
Alderman Ross.
Here.
Mayor Harmison.
Here. All right, welcome. This is a public meeting. At the end of the PowerPoint presentation, we'll have time to answer your questions. We're here to learn about tax increment financing and some other economic basic tools provided with Missouri law. We're not here to discuss any specific proposal tonight, so please keep your questions on point about how a TIF works only. We've received a TIF application from the Osage Beach Mall outlet. That proposal is subject to a public hearing of the Public TIF Commission meeting on June 3rd, 2022, right here in this room. If you have any questions about that project, you will have the opportunity to address the TIF Commission at that meeting. The developer will also have representation at that meeting. The mall outlet TIF proposal is available on our website. It consists of a TIF application and also a draft TIF plan. Those are public documents that you can download and review. So tonight we're going to have a couple of speakers. Welcome for questions at the end. We have Mark Spikerman. He's a partner with Gilmore and Bell's St. Louis office who concentrates his practice in Missouri economic development law. And we also have Ed Rucker, our city attorney. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mr. Rucker.
Thank you, Mayor. We're going to start this off. Mark and I have divided up the presentation a little bit. I'm going to give you the 50,000-foot view, and he's going to give the expert view from inside once the process gets going. On the back table, we have one is a sheet that will tell us, I'm sorry this isn't available online for you folks online, there's a sheet that will tell you exactly how to access the application that the mayor referred to, what you need to click on our website to get to that application. Those are public documents. The second thing on the back table is a copy of the PowerPoint presentation for those of you who have insomnia or problems lining the bottom of your bird cage. The third thing on the back table is a copy of the city's TIF policy. If you really have insomnia, that will work well too. The TIF policy, the operative parts which are of interest to most people begin on page 4, that's the policy considerations, and then on page 7, which is the part about accountability. The first 3 pages are kind of for the developer for how you, in fact, get going. So this is a talk that we've done several times. Basically, it's TIF and its cousins, and by its cousins, we also have some sections where Mark will explain what we call community improvement districts and transportation development districts. These are all part of a package of economic development tools the Missouri legislature's created and provided for us. So the first thing is, let's talk about design versus reality. In the 1960s and 70s, when tax increment financing began, when it first passed, the academic idea and the policy idea that was brought into the state legislatures wasn't what they have today. It's not that it's been amended, but it's a tool that didn't survive contact with what the economic realities are in our market, okay? But things you do need to know about TIF, and some of the basic lies about TIF that we want to rebut today is, one, it doesn't create new taxes. A tax increment financing plan does not create new taxes. It doesn't increase the tax rates that people are already paying. It doesn't disrupt an existing revenue stream. If a piece of ground is paying $100 to the Camdenton School District today, after that piece of ground is TIFed, it will continue to pay the same $100 to the Camdenton School District today. It doesn't abate the taxes. Tax increment financing does not wipe out taxes. You continue to pay those taxes. You will also sometimes hear developer jargon is the public-private partnership, okay? We want to be clear that some of the times this is a thing we do together, so we're working together to get a project done. That's a partnership. But under the law, a partnership is 2 or more people carrying on as co-owners of business for a profit. That's not the way TIF works. The city doesn't become a part owner of this. The city isn't buying into the development. The city doesn't get part of the money. Okay? The city doesn't share in the rents or the money the TIF makes. The city doesn't get any capital appreciation. The city doesn't depreciate it against other assets, okay? So it is not reasonable to expect the developer to walk in and say, hey, we're willing to share all this stuff, okay? It's a jargon word, but don't confuse it with what you think of as a partnership with two guys running an auto repair business. So what does it really do? Well, here's a few observations from our side of the fence. It socializes part of the economic risk. It's designed to take those places that are really hard to get someone interested in. It's designed to take those pieces of ground in a city that are really difficult to get somebody to help out and redevelop, okay? And alleviate part of their risk, part of that developer's risk, okay? So that they actually do something and the place doesn't just continue to rot, okay? The lure of TIF is the second and third order effects. By that we mean the increased economic activity. This is why cities create TIFs. This is why they consider it in the first place. It's the increased economic activity. It's eventually increasing revenues. It's new jobs. And it's attracting or retaining businesses in the city. The vocabulary. Now, the vocabulary goes by really fast. And, you know, between people who understand what they're talking about, between Mark and his partners, they'll talk about surplus pilots. And, you know, when I started as city attorney, I heard the term surplus pilots at least 25 times before I finally worked up my nerve to raise my hand and go, I'm not sure what you mean by surplus pilots. What's the extra? So there's a lot of jargon that goes on. The one operation here that you need to be clear on, it's easy for us lawyers to talk in jargon. If I say something in jargon tonight even that you don't understand, raise your hand. You're not expected to figure out what I'm trying to say. I'm expected to explain it in plain English. But I can't know that it didn't come through if you don't tell me. If you tell me, you're entitled to an explanation. Between Mark and me, we can figure out an explanation that'll make English sense. So let's talk about a quick rundown of the vocabulary. First is the pilots, the payments in lieu of taxes. That's the increment, that's the extra money the TIF project will generate. EATs are economic activity taxes. Easy way to think of that is sales taxes. Special allocation fund, that's nice jargon. Think of it as the pot that all the money goes into, okay? Reimbursable project costs are what the money comes out of the special allocation fund to help pay, okay? The plan is obviously, what is the developer going to do? Why do they want to do this, and what do they think they can do, and how are they going to pay for it? The area is simply the geographic area. The project is what are they going to build. TIF actually comes in two basic big hunks. It comes in a plan, and then it comes in a redevelopment agreement. The agreement is the bottom one on this slide, which is the TIF agreement, and that is the how does the money flow, what projects will be in fact funded, and by that mean what specific costs are funded, okay? So this is design meets reality, and I've done this slide several times. This is I wanted to show you so you understand why the process looks confusing, the difference between the way the original authors of the idea thought about it and now what's happened actually after it's met the market. The design is first the city establishes a TIF commission. The city sits around and says, you know, the 300 block of Elm Street doesn't work very well, so we need to do something about it. The current reality is a developer sees an opportunity. In the design, the city targets that area, 300 Elm Street. Here, the developer proposes a plan. They draft a plan. They have an idea what other public funding sources they may want. They've got an idea what they can do. The third step is the TIF commission reviews the plan. The plan's referred to the city council. The third step in the reality is the city reviews what they got from the developer, okay? They begin to negotiate about the contents of the plan and the agreement. The fourth thing in the way that it's designed is the city council approves a TIF plan. The fourth step in reality is the city then has to follow a technical part of the statute to solicit proposals. In my experience, there's only been one tax increment financing plan in the state of Missouri that has ever had more than one proposal. It's called the Glover Plan in Midtown, Kansas City. All the rest of them usually only get one proposal, and that's from the developer who saw the opportunity and brought it forth in the first place. Now, 5, for the design, the city solicits proposals from the developer for the TIF project. Here, 5, the TIF commission reviews the proposed TIF plan. If you will notice, under the design, the word developer doesn't occur till step 5. The way the world works is the developer begins with this, okay? The developer knows how to use this as a tool. Under design, projects and developers are then selected by the TIF commission and the council. Under the way the world works, the city approves the plan and the agreement. Then design, the agreement's executed. Frankly, under current reality, the last step is that agreement is executed. So I just want you to understand that the statute that the developer has to address wasn't designed to work the same way you see it working. That's why we, frankly, have lots of back and forth between the lawyers to make sure that we meet every little piece of the statute, and it is mind-numbingly complex. It's, you know, basically, there are lawyers in Mark's firm who are experts in tax, but they're not smart enough to do TIF. So, you know, he gets to do the TIF stuff. Okay, now this is the outline. This is a brief outline for how the money works, okay? TIFs can last for 23 years, hence your bottom line that stretches out. Then we talk about the tax revenues that come in. The existing property tax continues. The total property tax after redevelopment is the increment. The increment is what gets the developer interested in helping out. The people who get existing property tax today will continue to get that. Your local government, your school, your fire department, your library board, all those folks continue to get the same dollar they get now, okay? But after a developer has spent a bunch of money and redeveloped a property, the taxable value of the property will increase. The taxes will increase. Those increased taxes are the increment. What TIF does is it redirects that increment. The increment basically is captured and goes into the special allocation fund. And here we can get into real jargon-happy talk between the lawyers about a 50% surplus declaration back to the existing taxing entities, blah, 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 blah. If it gets confusing, let me know. But basically, the increment is what is created by the actions of the developer. It's new money. It is not money out of anybody's pocket. It's new money because they took a risk in the first place. We also have economic activity taxes. If it's vacant ground, it may create new sales taxes, okay? Or it may create new revenue if it literally creates more money out of something that previously exists. If a tax rate rises, the tax rate isn't captured by the TIF. There's a specific statute on that. So there's a lifestyle, there's an application and a plan, and it starts with the initial approach by the developer, and the package, and the governing body, and the improvement. But this is where it gets really complicated, so this is where I'm going to be quiet and Mark's going to take over. That's your laser pointer button? That's back and forth? Okay. Let's speak right into it.
Thank you, Ed. My name is Mark Spikerman. I'm a director at level attorney at Gilmore & Bell. For those of you who are not familiar with Gilmore & Bell, we represent only public entities. We do this just for Osage Beach, St. Louis, Kansas City, other cities throughout the state. We don't represent private developers. So we get called in by cities when there's a private developer on the other side and a deal needs to be worked out. Pop quiz. How many states do you think have a TIF Act? Any guesses?
23.
23? 49 plus the District of Columbia. Missouri's TIF Act is a direct descendant of Illinois' TIF Act, which is a direct descendant of someone else's TIF Act, and so on. Although they all change, they're all a little bit different. But they all have a basic concept of new redevelopment creates new taxes, and let's return those taxes into the project itself. So as we go through the statute, we go through the Missouri TIF Act here, how does it actually operate? Well, the city has a policy that it requires an application. The application is submitted to the city. There's a specific, as Ed mentioned earlier, there's an application form and policy considerations on the city's webpage. and the city staff begins review of that application. There's state law requirements. They want to make sure that the proposed project and the proposed plan meet the statutory requirements, ABC down the list in the law. They also want to make sure it complies with the city's policy. The city has additional policy goals that are in addition to the statute, and they want to make sure that those are met. And then finally, the plan just needs to make sense. We've seen it before. There's people submit plans based on misunderstandings or lack of knowledge, or sometimes, I've never met a pessimistic developer. They're usually very optimistic. Their project's the one that's going to work, but sometimes it's just too pie in the sky. But after the city's review, it goes back, said, yeah, this is a project we'll pursue, or we'll continue to evaluate. The city's not in the business of paying out of pocket to evaluate someone else's proposal, so they enter into a funding agreement. The funding agreement says developer will pay the city's costs as it reviews this TIF project. Those costs can be a planner, outside counsel. There's notices that need to be published and mailed. And as you can see down the line there, there's a 45-day notice. The next slide is going to talk about additional notices. We also have to file an RFP because we do, as I had mentioned on a previous slide, the statute says we have to get requests for proposals. Most cities will write into their request for proposals that they only want to see proposals from people who have control of the land. I'd mentioned, I think, one example of someone submitting an alternate proposal. I've seen a couple other ones. When I usually see them, though, they're not serious. They're actually meant to derail the main project. It's, it's grocery store A is proposing a TIF, and grocery store B doesn't want them to locate there, so they're going to propose something different, even though they have no intention of actually building it. So once the plan is put together, the city's approved its funding agreement, it's hired any planners or outside attorneys they want to use. The plan goes to the TIF Commission. The TIF Commission is made up of 11 members. 6 are appointed by the city, 3 are appointed by the county, 2 by the school district. 2 by the county, 2 by the school district, and 1 by the other taxing districts that are affected. Those 11 people make up the TIF Commission. They hold a hearing. They review the plan. They review the project. They issue a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen. There's just, going down the list, the notices again. This is a very transparent process. You're talking 45-day notice to the affected taxing district. 2 publications in the newspaper, not less than 10, not less than 30 days. Mailing to any property owners. There's a special sunshine law provision that requires 4 days posting of notice, not just the usual 24 hours. It's all very open, very transparent. Then as the TIF Commission meets, it holds its public hearing. Anyone who is interested is allowed to speak. Taxing districts, residents, whomever. The TIF Commission then confers and makes a recommendation. That recommendation can be, yes, we agree, please, Board of Aldermen, we suggest you approve this. Board of Aldermen, we don't like it, don't approve it. If they say no, the Board of Aldermen can overrule, but it takes a supermajority, 2/3 of the Board of Aldermen. If they say yes, it's a simple majority. The recommendation, the statute is silent as to whether there can be conditions on that recommendation. I've seen it before where a TIF Commission will come back and say, we like the project, but this has got to change. And when we see that, and because the statute's silent, we try to work with the TIF Commission before they take a vote so that the developer or the city can make changes to the plan, address those issues, and then come back with a plan that can get a clean up or down vote. If there is a change to the plan at that public hearing stage, there's a variety of different alternatives. One, you can leave the hearing open until the change can be made. 2, you could close it and redo the whole 45-day notice policy. It just depends on the facts at hand. But ultimately, again, it's a very transparent process. No changes would be hidden from the public. They would be out there. Notices would be given to taxing districts, residents, everyone. If we get through the Board of Aldermen, the TIF Commission says, yes, pass it. Board of Aldermen agrees. It's passed. We have a plan, but we don't have an action. We don't have the meat that goes into saying, how do we get from A to B? We just now know what B is. B is the project and the plan. We need a TIF agreement to say, developer will build this, they will submit this paperwork. In return, they will get TIF assistance in this form. As we get that agreement put in place, that takes an ordinance, a simple majority of the Board of Aldermen. It's going to spell out, developer's going to have to acquire the property if they don't already do it. Going to have to spell out when construction will begin, when it will be completed. Sometimes we put in to these agreements that an interim step that they have to prove financing. There's a requirement in the TIF Act that a plan has to include a commitment to finance. Sometimes in a redevelopment agreement, we want to know you closed on your loan, you're ready to break ground. We're not going to sit around for 2-3 years while you talk to a bunch of banks. We get through all that, we go on to other items. How does the developer apply for TIF assistance? Well, he's got to prove that he's incurred the costs. He's got to prove that he's put down that street, he's demoed that old building, he's done this, done that. If that happens, and becomes entitled to the receipt of TIF revenues as reimbursement or bond proceeds if there's bonds issued that are secured by TIF revenues. But we need something to pay him with. So he's got to pay those taxes, the base taxes, the pilots. His customers have to pay the sales taxes, or remit the sales taxes to him to remit to the Department of Revenue. And then as those incremental receipts come in, we now have a pot of money that we can use to reimburse the developer for eligible costs. So when we talk about eligible costs and payment, pilots, Ed said, was the incremental real property taxes, the increase in assessed value and real property taxes because we've renovated this building, because we've built a new building, whatever we've done to redevelop the area, increase the cost, the value. The county collector is going to put on the tax bill the amount of pilots and base all together. Property owner is going to pay that, just like they would any other taxes. And then the county collector will divide between base, increment, send the base to the taxing districts, send the increment to the city for deposit into the TIF Special Allocation Fund. There are a few exceptions. If you're a fire district or an ambulance district with a property tax, you do not have to participate in TIF. You can opt out. If you're a what we call a sheltered workshop or Senate Bill 40, I believe is it the Camden County Developmental Disability Board, they are also exempt from TIF. They get the full amount, base and increment back. And then if a taxing district were to, between now and whenever, approve a new tax increase or a new tax, if that tax was approved by the voters after the date that the city approves the redevelopment plan, that new tax is exempt from TIF. That's something that wasn't necessary when we approved the plan, so it's not going to be captured going forward.
Mark, would you go back over the ambulance fire district? I didn't hear the last piece.
Yeah, if you're an ambulance, fire district, or E911, call our emergency service providers, and you have a dedicated sales tax or use tax for that, you can opt out of TIF. The statute says you can request between 50 and 100% back from the TIF. So if, for instance, if the base was $1, the property's redeveloped and now it's generating $10, your ambulance or fire district could ask for the whole $10. Statute was changed a few years ago to allow that. It's their discretion, not the cities or the developers at that point. Now the interesting thing about that statute is it applies to ambulance and fire protection districts, but it does not provide, apply to city-run emergency service. So your city police department, or if you've got a city fire department, you're under the general rule.
Both property and sales tax?
Yep. And if the statute's not worded the best, so we often will, and you've done this on other TIFs as well, work with those emergency service districts to craft a 1 or 2 page agreement where we say, yes, we agree that this is what the statute means. If we're only gonna ask for 50% back or whatever the deal is, and then it's in writing and it's there for the life of the TIF. Why would they? Well, if you build development, there's going to be more emergency service calls to that development, and they're going to say, well, we need tax money to pay for those emergency service calls. Now we've seen statewide, we've seen most fire districts will opt out because they can, but we've seen a few occasions where they want to be helpful in attracting the development and making sure the project's a success, so they may agree to perhaps a 50% callback. And also, if they take all the money, or if they opt out completely, it also means that the TIF, with respect to other taxing districts, there'll be more pressure on those other taxing district levies. You know, if this were a TIF that were going to expire or be paid off early, for instance, well, it's now going to go longer because you're not including the fire district levy in those property taxes. So sometimes there's a little bit of a fair play with the other taxing districts involved in the decision making. And this is not specific to Osage Beach or anything. This is just hypothetical, what we see statewide. Thank you. So we've got the agreement on the sales tax side, or EATs, or economic activity taxes. Again, your customers will be paying them. It's not an additional sales tax. They're paying the same rate. It's just the taxes that would otherwise go to the city or the does the county have a sales tax here? Yeah, city or the county get redirected into the TIF special allocation fund and are made available to pay taxes. Now, the difference between the EATs and the pilots is that the pilots, other than those exceptions I mentioned, it's 100% capture. Anything above that $1 is now captured. On the EATs, you've got the base, and then you've got the increment, but then the increment's split in half. So only half of the increment goes to the special allocation fund. The other half remains with the taxing districts. And likewise, there are exceptions. Some fire and ambulance districts have sales taxes. Those taxes are subject to the same opt-out mechanisms. If there's a new voter-approved tax, those taxes are not subject to TIF either. The other thing on the sales tax, just to be clear, is that it doesn't affect the state portion of the sales tax. So the state portion of the sales tax is 4.225%, and then the city and county have about 2% total. So it's only the 2% city-county portion that's subject to TIF, not the 4.225 for the state. Kind of gone through that as far as we get the pilots, the real estate taxes are collected through the county collector. The sales taxes are collected through the Department of Revenue. When they come back to the city, they're actually coded within a TIF, so the city knows how to do which taxes to deposit and where. When we do have an agreement, a redevelopment agreement, as I'd mentioned, one of the city's policy perspectives is we need to be accountable. We need to be accountable and tracking and transparent every year. So there's monitoring, there's clawbacks, there's disclosure of developer information. Sometimes if a project needs to meet milestones along the way. It'll be written into contract. Most of that is not within the statute. It's extra stuff. It's extra safeguards. But there are some statutory reporting requirements. There's an annual form that gets filled out on the Department of Revenue website. That form, unfortunately, I'm not sure exactly what the state does with it. They do publish it, and then they appear to forget about it for the next 50 years. But it does get published. You can look up information on any TIF in the state, both on the Department of Revenue website, and then the state auditor also website has a link to it. You've got to publish an annual statement in the newspaper each year regarding how much TIF revenue was received and expended. And then you have to have a hearing every 5 years, a public hearing where someone will make a presentation and say, this is where the project is today, versus what we expected it to be. Now, several years ago, the statute did not have any sort of penalty for noncompliance. And as you might imagine, if there's no stick, there wasn't a whole lot of compliance statewide. So they had a great idea of let's make a penalty. Let's say cities who fail to make the reporting required by statute shouldn't be allowed to do TIF. So they wrote a law, they passed it, and then they had a problem because not only had there been very little, and I'm not saying Osage Beach didn't do it, but statewide, very few cities complied completely. But then they had no way of proving whether they complied or didn't comply because they didn't have the records from years back. So then the state had to come back and revise the law, and now it says that if you did not comply, the Department of Revenue will now send you a notice, and you'll get an opportunity to cure, to file those past reports. You won't be banned for TIF forever. But if you do get that notice and you still do nothing, then you will not be allowed to approve TIF projects for 5 years. So flash forward 10, 15, 20, potentially 23 years. Our project's done. It's been generating TIF revenues, pilots, and eats for years. If we've issued bonds, maybe those bonds are now paid off. If it was what we call a pay-as-you-go, maybe that obligation has ended. What do we do? Well, the TIF Act has a procedure for ending a TIF. Board of Aldermen passed an ordinance. They would dissolve the special allocation fund. We'd make sure that all the county, the state know that the TIF is over so that they will no longer be diverting revenues where they shouldn't go. Now all tax revenues will go to the taxing districts. And, sometimes we have oftentimes we have a situation where, the developers owed $5 more, and this month's TIF revenue collections are $1,000. So what do you do with the extra? You send it back to the taxing districts. It's not the city's money, it's the taxing district's money.
Did I understand correctly that there are some states do have an option whether they do that or not?
So some cities, sure. And I'm going to rephrase it and stop me if I rephrase it poorly or wrongly. The question was whether some cities have the option of what we would refer to as a surplus declaration, that taking TIF dollars anytime during the life of the TIF and sending it back to the taxing districts. And the answer is yes. You can at any point, as long as you're not contractually obligated not to do so in your redevelopment agreement, declare TIF revenues to be surplus. That means they're not needed for the redevelopment project, they're not needed for the implementation of the redevelopment plan, and that they can flow back to the taxing districts just like regular taxes. And the city's past TIF plans have almost universally had some level of surplus. They, well, it depends on how the plan was written, but yeah, surplus is not required by statute. It's until now, if you've paid off all your your redevelopment plan costs and you don't have any eligible TIF costs left, then the only thing to do is to declare it surplus. It's not like you can use it for non-eligible purposes. So what are the potential uses for TIF revenues? It's a really broad list. You can go starting with land acquisition, demolition, clearing, site prep, roads, streets, infrastructure, renovation, rehabilitation of privately owned buildings. Why is all that allowed? Because the purpose of TIF, one of the purposes of TIF, is to remediate blight. It's not under the state constitution, the city has a requirement to always act with a public purpose. The primary intent of any city action has to be for a public purpose. Missouri courts have determined several times over the years that remediation of blight is a public purpose. Curing that blight, or with respect to TIF, there's actually a term called a conservation area, which essentially means on its way to being blighted, but not quite there. And that is also, solving those problems are also a public purpose under, as courts have said. And when you have that, you can have private benefit, such as, we've renovated this building that's owned by a private person, as long as the primary intent was the public purpose of getting rid of that blight. So we've got potential uses: blight remediation, site prep, land acquisition, demolition, clearing, renovation of buildings. How have municipalities expended their TIF revenues? Sometimes it's direct sort of blight remediation. It's tearing down blighted buildings. It's sometimes it's public infrastructure. We're going to create new infrastructure, and that infrastructure is going to be so great that private investment's going to follow. They're going to want to be located next to that nice new street. Sometimes it's direct assistance to a project. We know that if the city contributes X dollars in TIF revenues, we're going to get this great project, and it's going to generate a lot of tax revenues, both on-site and surrounding development. As you create an anchor, and then people will want to locate around that anchor. Community Improvement District. This is what Ed mentioned were the cousins of TIF. So at the beginning, Ed mentioned TIF was not tax abatement. You pay the same amount of taxes. TIF was tax redirection, because you're redirecting taxes from A to B. Community Improvement Districts, or CIDs, are additional taxes, but they're only within a specified district, not citywide, not countywide, just these lines on a map, such as a shopping center, or some cities have downtown CIDs where it's just the downtown district. These CIDs are created by petition of the property owner. You need to have more than half of your property owners, both per capita, which means if you have 3 property owners, you need at least 2 of them. If you have 5, you need at least 3 of them. And by assessed value. So if you've got one person in your CID who owns more than 50% of the assessed value in that district, that person's going to have to be one of the signatories to the petition. If a petition is filed, the statute says the city clerk must review it, make sure it complies with the statute, and then it gets forwarded to the Board of Aldermen, who then hold a public hearing regarding the creation of the CID. Notices are published once a week for 2 consecutive weeks before the public hearing. Notices are mailed to all property owners in the district. It's a very transparent process. That special 4-day sunshine law requirement applies to this as well. At the public hearing, everyone is allowed a chance, all interested parties are allowed a chance to speak for or against, ask questions. After the public hearing, the city council may then establish the district by ordinance approving the petition. Once the CID is established, it is a separate entity. It is not the city. It is a completely separate board of the city. It's a separate political subdivision. It's going to have its own EIN number, which is a federal tax ID number. It will be governed by a board of directors. Two options for those board of directors. About 99% of CIDs are governed by a board appointed by the mayor with the consent of the Board of Aldermen. However, the members of that board have to be representatives of the property owners or business owners in the district. With one exception, last year, there was a change in state statute that said one board member now needed to be a sort of disinterested party.
What again?
A disinterested party, someone who lives in the city but is not the developer or employed by the developer, someone who's sort of independent. The CID can impose a sales tax, a property tax, and or a special assessment. Most CIDs are sales tax. We often see CIDs and TIFs overlaid because if you have a CID and a TIF, 50% of that CID revenue now becomes TIF revenue. CID sales tax revenue now becomes TIF revenue. It kind of supercharges the TIF a little bit. CIDs themselves can be used for not quite as broad of a list as TIF, but they have some interesting powers. One is that although they can be used for sidewalks and street improvements and other sorts of public infrastructure, they can also be used for certain services. Some CIDs fund additional security, cameras or safety officers. Some CIDs can fund sort of marketing, come to downtown wherever. The restriction for a CID, the main restriction though, is that the dollars have to be used within the boundaries of the CID. So we run into that sometimes when they draw a map. If they don't draw the map to include the street next to it, they can't use the CID to actually improve that street. They can only use the CID within the boundaries. CIDs that are in blighted areas have additional powers. They have the power to remediate blight, which means they can also assist in renovating privately owned buildings. The other cousin we hear a lot about is Transportation Development District. Similar to the CID, it's a separate board, it's not the city. It's got its own EIN, it's its own political subdivision. Transportation Development Districts, or TDDs, are created in a completely different manner though. Most TDDs are created by petition of the property owners without involvement of the city, well, at least at that stage. They petition the circuit court, not the city. Circuit court then gets to approve the petition. And then the property owners themselves elect a board of directors. Now there is an alternative procedure for that where the city and the county and other sort of governmental entities can directly petition themselves. There's a handful of those type of TDDs around the state. Probably the closest one to here would be Rolla. That sort of alternate procedure is usually used in extremely large TDDs. The one in Rolla, I think, has about 89 different property owners, and as you might imagine, getting all 89 property owners to sign a single petition would be pretty much impossible. Transportation Development Districts, the uses, it's got to be transportation related, and it's got to be public. You can't fund a public parking lot or a private parking lot. Now you can come up with creative ways to make what seems like a private parking lot actually a public-private parking lot. But if you do, it is a public parking lot. You can't close it off for private events. If someone wants to picket or protest, they've got First Amendment rights to be on that parking lot. You're subject to the case law around that. That procedure refers to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. So you can ban overnight parking, but you can't necessarily ban somebody at 5 o'clock on a Tuesday from waving a picket, protesting. TDDs, similar to CIDs, sales tax, property tax, special assessment. And those sales taxes or property taxes would be, could become TIF revenues if also within a TIF area. So statewide tracking of TIF. A few slides ago, I mentioned there was a annual report. These are some of the categories that annual report requires the city to divide the TIF reimbursable costs into. And you'll see a similar, within a TIF redevelopment plan, you'll see a similar breakdown of categories of estimated costs at that point. And so there is, when the Department of Revenue collects that information on an annual basis, kind of interestingly, they'll make you fill out the same form 23 times for 23 years, but after the project's built, the numbers don't change. It's copy and paste for hopefully 2 decades. There is then a repository for that information. Someone can look back and compare TIF plan to actual expenditures. Ed, do you want to wrap it up, or do you want me to?
This is just part of it, and we agreed we'd share this at the thing. Okay, TIF is just a tool, okay? You will see in the popular press and in the newspapers people who are for or against TIF. It's like being for or against a hammer, for or against your table saw in your shop, okay? Properly used, a hammer in Jimmy Carter's hands will build a house. In Lizzie Borden's hands, it was an instrument of murder. The other question becomes, how many TIFs are too many? Well, one failure is a problem, but if you have multiple projects, they're within budget, and they're paying for themselves, then they're successful. One of the other objections we've heard, at least here in Osage Beach before, is the problem of cannibalism. That is, what is TIF going to do to our existing businesses? Is it going to depress things? And you know, in college economics, Schumpeter talks about creative destruction. That part of the engine of capitalism is that, you know, the harness makers got run out of business by Henry Ford and the automobiles. Okay, this is part of change. This is competition. This is the why things get better. If we don't do this, it doesn't get better. Now, it's not our lawyer's job to tell you when it's better or not. That's the job of the TIF Commission. That's the job of the elected officials. That's the job of our Board of Aldermen. We will make the paper work, but that's it. Where's the?
One thing to that. Absolutely. That is absolutely correct. There is, though, one safeguard they did build into the law, and it applies in a kind of a limited area. But if your TIF project's a brand new shopping center, and that new developer is going to the retail tenant across the street and saying, I'm going to give you discounted rent if you come over across the street into my new TIF. The TIF Act has a procedure for the city to declare a relocated business. The effect of that declaration is that whatever that base value was in the new TIF, well, it's now been summed up by whatever taxes the guy across the street was now paying. So now the developers sort of, in that sense, is dissuaded from reaching out to existing tenants in the city because it's no benefit to them. They're going to bring their base over. It's going to mean less TIF revenues overall.
And that, my dear clients, is why we hire Gilmore Bell. There's also a problem in terms of the design meets reality. You know, an investor is a person who's tied to a property. A developer is a person who finds an opportunity. A developer will buy an option, okay? A developer will say, yes, I'm interested in this. You know, what we look for is we look for people who can get a deal done, okay? We look for people who are looking to make sure that they can do something happen. Now, you obviously have to have a property in mind because you can't just walk in and say, well, gee whiz, I think I'd like to do something good here. Can I have a TIF? Okay? You have to have it here. You have to have a specific location. But people that buy the options, people that say, there's an option, I want to lock that property up, that helps. Okay? So, accountability measures, financial performance. These are the things that get negotiated in the agreement, not in the TIF plan, but in the agreement between the Board of Aldermen and the developer. We will negotiate financial performance, what will be spent, what the revenues are, how many jobs will be created, okay? If you don't create how many jobs, what's the consequence of not creating how many jobs? A construction and occupancy schedule, clear the ground and when you will build and open the project. Our community has direct experience with construction and occupancy schedule problems because literally, was it last year or 2 years ago, Gene? I can't remember. I think it was 2 years ago. We extended the Osage Beach Commons TIF construction schedule because of the effects of the COVID-19 shutdown of the economy, essentially, and gave them an extra 2 years, and that's why they're building Hobby Lobby today. You're not married to this stuff. These contracts can be living documents back and forth between the city and the developer as the needs go to just get things done. So, how does the city ensure it gets its side of the bargain? That is, what does it want, okay? Well, you have to meet your financial projections, meet your schedule, meet something in terms of public participation. If the developer all of a sudden gets 25% of return on his investment, he didn't need TIF in the first place, okay? Most developers will be reasonable about that, and we've had discussions with them, and sure, they're going to moan and groan whenever we put a number on the table. Whatever number we say is going to be way too low. Whatever number they say is going to be way too high. We can always get to a deal, though. We can always get to something because everybody wants the thing built. But the taxpayers are entitled to understand that no, you know, if the developer makes $1 gazillion on this, then we really didn't have to support it. Remedies, well, you can withhold money, you can have other penalties. That's a contract by contract situation, and that's a standard by standard situation. A remedy for jobs versus a remedy for how much income you're going to produce versus a remedy for protecting city revenue, okay? But those are all negotiation points. Those are all things that can be negotiated that protect the public purse and help the developer get things built. Here's the sum of it is this, okay? And as you all can tell, Mark is the expert and I'm the old guy. Any third-year law student can kill a deal. It takes nothing. Any third-year law student can sit around and ask enough sophisticated, intelligent, important questions that they kill a deal and the developer runs screaming from the room. That's not what we're here for, and that's not what you want us to do. Our goal is a defensible deal, a plan that works. A defensible deal is proportionate. In other words, it makes sense in terms of the money spent, how much money the city puts in, how much money the developer puts in. How big a project are we talking about? In what space? A defensible deal is achievable. It's got an actual plan that makes sense, okay? It's not the pie in the sky. It is not, as Mark talked about, the grocery store walked in and says, I'm going to do another grocery store simply because I want to mess with your grocery store. Okay? It's an achievable deal that works, that makes something happen in the community. Did I misspell that word? Don't look at that. Okay, it's accountable. In other words, the developer's held to account for what they're going to do. The city's held to account for what it's going to do. And it's transparent. And that's the most important thing, I think, up there. It's got to be transparent. We aren't dealing with anybody else's money but yours. The money on the table is tax dollars. These are tax dollars that citizens contribute through their taxes, okay? These sales taxes, these are tax dollars that the developer contributes through their real estate taxes, and the developers are, in fact, citizens, okay? So that deal has to be transparent. It has to make sense. That's why this is a public process, and that's why you get all of this, the notices, the public hearing, the bending over backwards situation where what we want to do is be sure that everyone had an opportunity to be heard. This is not the lawyers in the back room spending your money. This is my favorite part of this, is the editorial board versus Mick Jagger. In Kansas City, the editorial board of the Star has a hissy fit every time the city wants to build something, okay? They would hyperventilate about tax increment financing if a developer asked for $100,000 to help build a $10 million project because they were going to remediate blight where rats were calling out of the sewers. They just don't like it. My friend Mick Jagger said that you can't always get what you want, but if you try real hard, just sometimes you might get what you need. And that's what we as the lawyers are aiming to get you, is just to get you what you need, okay? So that's sort of the end of the presentation, and fortunately the folks at home aren't going to be able to ask many questions, but we can take questions here now from the Board of Aldermen, from anybody in the audience. Anybody's got a question, speak up. Or if you're really bored and we've lawyered you to death, you can all go home and get dinner.
And Mark, would you mind, I've been doing a lot of reading over this over the course of the last few weeks, and can you give us an example using real numbers, saying property's worth $10 million, once it's completed it's worth $100 million, and how the tax increment financing would be distributed to the developers, and using that scenario, give us some sort of dollar amount, what would go into the fund, and how it's distributed, using real numbers as an example?
Sure. What's the total property tax rate around here? Like 7, 6, 6,
Just approximate, yeah.
7.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got a piece of property. It's a big piece of property. It's worth $1 million today, and it's in commercial use. So $1 million true value, 32% commercial assessment rate, $320,000 assessed value. Assessed value times tax rate divided by 100. Somebody's got a calculator. 320 times.
Approximate, yeah.
About 20-something.
$21,000.
$21,000 of taxes.
Okay.
Your school district's probably getting about 60% of that. The city, does the city have a property tax? Yeah. So school district's getting 60%, the other folks are getting the other 40%. If we get, and 60% of 21,000 is about 13,000. Flash forward, the area's been redeveloped. It's now worth 10 million. 10 million times 32% assessed value, commercial assessed property rate, now has an assessed value of 3,200,000. 3,200,000 times 7 divided by 100. 220,000?
210.
210. So school district's still getting 13. The difference between, and the other taxing districts are getting the other 8. So that those taxing districts in total are still getting 21. The additional amount of taxes, almost $200,000 in that scenario, is going into this TIF special allocation fund. And it's being used on a pay-as-you-go basis, which just means that we're reimbursing the developer as those tax revenues come in, or to pay off bonds, which means we've issued bonds secured by future TIF revenues. That $200,000 is now available for those uses. Now, our contract and our plan are going to set a maximum reimbursement. So if our maximum reimbursement in that scenario was $1 million, with interest, they're probably paying off in 5-6 years, and then the TIF is over. If our maximum reimbursement was more like 5 or 6 million, then you can see how it would go potentially 15, 20, 23 years.
And then the CIDs and the TDDs, what percentage are those?
So CIDs and TDDs can each levy up to a 1% sales tax, and then they can have property tax rates. Not sure, there may be a limit on the maximum CID property tax rate. I'd have to look back at that. Most CIDs do sales taxes. And then they can also do special assessment. So a special assessment, usually it's done, X dollars per square foot of your lot, or street frontage, linear feet. CIDs will often, when imposed on a hotel, will sometimes base their special assessments on occupied room nights, $2 a night. Those dollars then become available for the CID's purposes. When a CID and TIF are overlaid together, chances are the CID purposes and the TIF purposes also overlay. It's that Venn diagram, so to speak, with 2 circles overlapping. And you can use those CID revenues to pay off the TIF costs, because they're sort of dual qualified as both TIF and CID expenditures. that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
Yep, and the TDD would work the same way.
Boy, am I glad you were here.
Yes.
Room tax. Is that applicable to anything with CIDs and TIF and et cetera, et cetera? They
So-
call it room tax, bed tax?
So
Lodging tax, I mean, I guess they're all the same.
Yeah. The short answer is no. One of the exceptions in the TIF Act, which I failed to mention earlier, is that TIF does not capture sales taxes, whether it be the lodging authority here or the city sales taxes, on the sale of hotel room nights. That's a state law thing. So it would capture the gift shop sales, the restaurant room service, but it would not actually apply to the sales of a hotel room. Now, your CID and your TDD, that additional 1% sales tax, that would apply to a room night, but the TIF is the only thing that's exempted.
The TIF does not, but the CIDs and the NIDs and the
So the CID and TDD, when they impose an additional 1% sales tax, those room night sales are subject to those
to
taxes.
the additional.
Yep. But the redirection part of a TIF does not apply to room night sales. So the city and the county get 100% of sales taxes generated from room night sales. It's only on the gift shop and the restaurant that they have to redirect taxes for TIF. And then, of course, any other retail use.
Janine had a question.
Well, when you talked about the TIF, you mentioned all the things.
Give her the microphone, please.
You mentioned the things that could be used.
Right.
What can't it be used for?
Anything else?
Well, it can't be used for purely private purposes. You can't building a private club if it's if it's not associated with the remediation of blight. You couldn't do that. You can't pay operating costs really, like a developer's operating costs. I mean, there's some overhead and development fees that would be really considered upfront construction fees, but you're sort of it's not an ongoing business subsidy.
And that's it?
And then
Can you build new buildings?
that is a gray area in the statute. So some practitioners take the position no, some take the position yes.
Okay, correct me if I get this wrong now. There's not an explicit provision on it. There's not an explicit prohibition. Most of the time what would happen if you were looking at an application like that is those costs can be shifted to one thing or another that is more amenable to being clearly under the statute.
That's a great answer, Ed. So the city's TIF policy, I believe, is usually TIF should not exceed about 15% of a total project cost. So generally, there's more than 15% of easily qualifiable costs, whether that be land acquisition, demolition, grading, site prep.
Mark, do they keep any statistics on the success rate of TIFs in the state of Missouri over the last 10 years?
No, and I've been asked this question a few times before, and the part I always struggle with is what is a successful project? Because I know some cities will mean a successful project is one where the TIF pays off early. That's great. That's clearly a successful project. Other cities will say, as long as the project got built and it's doing all right, I'm happy. So and there are, I would say statewide, probably most projects fall into it got built and I'm okay with it, rather than like the home run smashing success.
Mayor, that actually goes sometimes to the difference between what elected officials are looking for and what the developer's looking for. What the developer can actually control, I mean, think of this from the developer's point of view. What a developer can control is creating the building, okay? Clearing the site, building the building that they promised to build and marketing the thing. Now, normally, we don't proceed unless we already know that they've got enough people that they're going to have 50% tenancy under the policy this board's adopted. But, for instance, there are TIFs where outside Independence, Missouri, there's a Bass Pro Shop that's TIFed. Now, that TIF actually hit Independence, Missouri's general fund because it didn't pay off the way it was supposed to. But it's still an open.
That was a voluntary decision by the city.
Right, right.
That's not all TIFs are like that. Very
Correct.
few TIFs are.
Right. But the thing is, the Bass Pro's still open. It works great, and they sold me a great fishing rod. So, you know, it goes exactly to what Mark talked about. What's the definition of success? For elected officials, a lot of the question is, did it generate jobs? Did it generate new revenue? Did it generate additional economic activity? That's what those are the public goods that TIF can generate when it works completely. So that's, and the balance there is between what the elected officials want and what the developer wants. And then once you all figure out what the balance is, Mark will figure out how to write it.
I actually have the opposite example too. I'm familiar with the TIF that was for a Kmart back when there were Kmarts, when there were new Kmarts. And there was a Kmart there for a few years. It didn't last. But a call center moved in, and from outward appearances, we've got this big empty box with very few windows and no signage, and yeah, there's a few dozen cars there every day between 9 and 5, but there's nothing on the weekends. And it looks like a failure, but the TIF paid off. I mean, it was occupied, it paid property taxes. You know, is that a success?
Mark, on property taxes and how it is determined what goes into the pilot, you gave the example of basically, you know, the value is worth $1, and so now we put improvements on it and it's worth $2. So, you know, there's that extra dollar is what we're seeing improvement. Give me an example of how the sales tax works when you take a piece of an area and it's you know, you're going to take some of the sales tax towards the TIF project. Do we look at, are we able to quantify the amount of sales tax that it produced? And if we do we only quantify what they produced in the previous year, the previous 2 years, the previous 10 years? Can you walk me through that?
Sure. So say we've got Alderman Rucker's General Store. It generates $1,000 of sales tax a year. Alderman Rucker sells out to big developer who puts a giant shopping center on it, and now it's generating $101,000 a year in sales tax. So the base, the 1,000, still goes to the taxing districts, split up between the city and the county. The additional 100,000 then gets cut in half. So the top half, 50,000, goes to the TIF. The bottom half, the other 50,000, goes to the taxing districts. So now our taxing districts end up with 51,000. TIF ends up with 50,000.
Is the example you use of the 1,000 of what that my business made, that was that just for that last year? You don't
is measured.
You don't have any reason to, or there's no justification to go back further and say, well, wait a second, over the past 2 or 3 years, he averaged $2,000 or any, just that last year?
By statute, it's the year before the redevelopment plan is approved. Now, as an aside, on the property tax side, the base year is the last reasonably ascertainable assessed value. So if you approve your plan in the fall and you already know your assessed values for that year, then that same, if we approved a plan in November of 2022, our assessed values for base year purposes would be 2022 assessed values. If we approved it in March of 2022, we don't know this year's assessed values yet, so it would be 2021. But for sales tax purposes, it's always the full calendar year before. Now, as part of a redevelopment agreement, and the city's done this, I think, in the past, and I've seen it in other cities, if there is a decline because you've now torn down the store in 1 year and you're waiting, and the new development's taking a couple years to be built, sometimes we have sort of like hold harmless provisions in our redevelopment agreement. And this is outside of statute, it's negotiable, but we've seen it where the developer agrees to basically make a payment that holds those tax revenues or payments in lieu of those tax revenues at that sort of pre-demolition value, just so that there's no temporary dip.
Well, I got you. I got a few more I'll go ahead and hit you with. The percent of revenue that you put into the pilot, okay, by law, that's 50% of the
The
increase.
pilot is 100%, the EATS is 50%, and then they have those exceptions for the fire districts.
And that's law.
That's law, yep.
There's no negotiation about that.
Right, the surplus declaration. We can negotiate, and the city has done this in the past, right off the top, we're going to say, this level of pilots, we're not going to apply to the project, we're going to send back to the taxing districts.
Now, the portion of that is negotiable is the percentage of how much you apply towards the overall project. Whether it's 10%, 15%, or whatever. If the project's $1 million, how much of that million can you use TIF money for? That is negotiable, correct?
That is fully negotiable, yeah.
Okay. And then the other thing is the years. The maximum by law is 23.
Correct.
Again, that's the maximum. That's negotiable as well if you want it paid off in something less. That's a negotiable portion
Correct.
as well.
Yep.
Okay, I just want to make sure I'm clear on that. Now I get into my one that really I'm confused on. First of all, can you explain the terminology clawbacks? And then, let's get the explanation of it, and then talk about how it works. I've got it in my mind, but I want to make sure I understand it.
So the term clawbacks, people use it in a much more broad sense than it was probably intended to be used for. I think the main concept of clawback is somebody has been enriched in a way that they shouldn't have, and now we're clawing that enrichment back. They got all this TIF revenue that they didn't need, so we're taking it back. How I see a lot of cities actually do it in practice is it's really hard to get money that you've already paid to somebody back, but we can make sure not to pay them in the future. And so we can shut off payment streams. There's some cities will wait until a project's fully completed, do an accounting upon that completion standpoint, and say, okay, you came under budget, so we're gonna let the TIF share in the good fortune and just provide less of an incentive because you didn't need as much because you came under budget. There's a few ways to skin the cat and the city's had some really sort of creative ways to do it in the past.
Yeah. We have some in the last two TIFs.
Right. Well, I guess the other way that I was looking at it is that can you put the clawbacks in there of performance? Is that part of where the clawbacks come in? Example, we're going to create 1,000 new jobs in the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. The project goes on and they create 200 new jobs. You indicated, and I assume you'd have to put a clawback in the agreement saying, if you don't achieve your 1,000 jobs, we're going to do something?
So you can do that, and I recognize that that's an extreme example. But one of the things you have to be careful with is you put so much restriction, you put so much clawback on the purpose of the TIF is to make this project a go. If I'm a bank that's going to lend to a developer, and I know that the project doesn't, the numbers don't pencil out unless they get this TIF, and then I hear that the condition is that they have to create 1,000 jobs, and if they create 999, they don't get any TIF, then I'm probably not making a loan on that deal, and the project doesn't happen. So it's a balancing test. You've got to find a clawback that's fair, that's transparent, that's accountable, but doesn't go so far that it kills the deal.
Right.
Alderman Rucker, in the past, we've had provisions like that, especially in terms of job creation, that there's a formula that becomes, essentially a proportional punishment, okay? It's a proportional withholding of that, so it's not an all or nothing thing. And an all or nothing thing, yes, will kill the deal. Something proportional then becomes, well, we expected X, we got 80% of X, what's the penalty? And even then, when you get to that point, okay, I mean, we're all coming out of an unprecedented time in our country's history with COVID, where nobody expected it, and nobody knew what was going to happen. So when you hit that kind of a point, then it's still a matter of contract between the developer and the city in terms of what you're actually going to do. The city may insist on its full rights or not. The only reason I want to interject this is we've looked at this issue before. It's in some of our other agreements, but it is never all or nothing. It always has to be proportional, because what we don't want is a developer looking at us going, you guys are completely unreasonable. Now, we don't want the taxpayers looking at us going, well, you guys forgot to stand up for yourselves. But there is a proportional level of punishment versus failure to perform, because some things are out of a developer's control and out of a developer's possibility of control. And for that, they should not be punished. Back to my expert.
Exactly. Just we're hitting all the buzzwords here: proportionate, accountable, transparent. It comes in almost every aspect of the TIF. Any other questions?
I got some more.
Go for it.
What is the monitoring tool that's in place on tax increments on TDDs?
On monitoring for TDDs?
Yeah, to make sure that because there's no the board is totally the entity themselves,
Yep.
so that's the total board. Who's making sure that those funds are being spent in the correct way?
So there's a few mechanisms we use. Some are mandatory, some are optional. Mandatory state law, state auditor audits every TDD every 3 years. They occasionally select specific TDDs for closer looks. Unfortunately, those audits tend to be pretty toothless. They get a bad press release and everybody moves on. Additionally, when setting up a TDD, the TDD itself has to enter into a transportation project agreement with the affected transportation authority. So if the project were improvements to Highway 54, they'd be entering into that agreement with MoDOT. If the improvements were to a city street, they'd be entering into that agreement with the city. As part of that agreement, you're going to make sure that there's going to be conditions for performance, making sure the project gets done, completed, all permits, specs are met. That's state law. What we like to do by contract and other mechanisms is we can, even though the state law says that the board has to be governed by authorized representatives of the property owners and the board of and the business owners, we can make sure that those property owners authorize city designated people to be their representatives. It's kind of an end around to take control of the boards and to manage those boards ourselves so that we can ensure that they're accountable, transparent, available, meeting what's the purposes they were intended for.
Since we're the local transportation authority, okay? And I haven't found a case on this, and if there's something you know, hang out. But since we're the local transportation authority on everything except Highway 54 driving through Osage Beach, we would be the entity that inherits that infrastructure built with the TDD. So we get served with the petition when it's filed in circuit court. I really can't imagine any circuit judge I've ever seen in my life, and I've seen a bunch of them since my hair was brown, granting a transportation development district creation petition against an answer filed by the local transportation authority, us, the city, saying, we don't want the deal. If you authorize this judge, it's going to be orphan infrastructure 25 years from now or 50 years from now, whenever it runs out. All those details, the contract provisions Mark is talking about, usually get worked out between the developer and the local transportation authority, the city, or MoDOT, okay, before the petition is ever filed. Okay, it's not like we have a court fight. What we want to do is we all want to go to the judge and say, Judge, we got a deal, and have him sign off on the deal. But we still have, you, not me and Mark, but you as the client still has the right to say, we don't think this is a good enough deal. File an answer and tell the judge we don't want to do it.
That's right, and I haven't ever seen a judge grant a TDD in the objection of the city. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen the city object to one because the deal's always been worked out before it gets to court. And with respect to the board governance, you can do the similar thing with the CID as well.
Okay.
Yes.
So just one quick question, but I think it may become relevant. The bonding issue, there's a perception out there from people that at least I perceive that if, for example, a TIF was approved, built, and through the process it was bonded, and the bond and the development itself couldn't pay the bonds, that the public entity, i.e. the city, would be on the hook for those. But I don't believe that's the case. Is that true?
You are correct. The bonds, unless you do something like the City of Independence did with the Bass Pro, but normal TIF bonds are what when I wear my bond counsel hat, we refer to as special limited obligations. They are payable only from TIF revenues, or if there's CID and TDD revenues pledged to them to the extent those revenues are generated. If those revenues are not generated, it's the people who bought the bonds that are at risk. Even so when municipal bonds are sold, if they're publicly underwritten, there's disclosures on, it's called the EMMA, the Electronic Municipal Marketplace. It's run by the MSRB. It's a website where you can look up the bond status of any city, county, fire district, public water supply district, pretty much anywhere in the country that's ever issued bonds. And if there are negative consequences affecting those bonds, like somebody had a draw on a reserve fund or they defaulted on the payment of interest, notices get published there. And so even if TIF bonds, because there wasn't TIF revenue, didn't pay, there'd be a notice published there, but that notice would say, hey, this project didn't perform. It's not the city's responsibility. It's the project's responsibility. And then credit rating agencies see that. It ends up not affecting really the city's
So just for clarity, what I think you just said is it shouldn't or wouldn't affect our credit rating if we were to supposedly go out and build a sewer project in the future, that bond rating would not necessarily be affected.
It would not. Now, if you had 30 TIF projects and they were all underwater, then maybe the rating agency would say, hey, maybe things aren't so good here and I'm going to ding the whole city. But a single project that's underperforming will not affect the city's rating.
As a follow-up to that, 23 years is the life of the TIF. So the project doesn't do well, and the 23 years comes and it's done. No more money goes into the bond thing, and the bond is not paid off because each year it didn't perform.
Right. If there were $5 million of principal left at the end of year 23, that's not the city's responsibility.
At that point, does the bond holder have the ability to go against the project and say, we want ownership of it or a piece of it? Can they go to court and
no,
since they didn't have their loan paid off?
Their risk is that if it's not paid off at year 23, it's not paid off.
Interesting.
Can you describe why independence
Yeah. Now some of this is almost going to sound like converse to intelligence, but sometimes things pay off quicker if you make the duration longer or you promise more revenue to pay it off. And the way that works is when bonds are sold, the underwriters will look at what they call coverage. Do I have projected revenues that are 1 times estimated debt service, 2 times estimated debt service, 3 times estimated debt service? And so if your bonds go out longer, for instance, one thing we often see is, TIF is capped at 23 years, but CIDs can go 27. So you can use a industrial development authority, issue bonds for 27 years. The TIF wears off after 23. The TIF's done, and then you've got 24, 25, 26, 27 that could be payable just from CID. Well, those extra 4 years give the bond investors a little more comfort. Say, hey, okay, if the TIF goes away, I still got 4 years of CID to protect my investment. So now I'm going to start bidding down my interest rate. Instead of requiring a higher interest rate, it's a safer investment, so I'll bid a lower interest rate. If you've got a lower interest rate, you've got lower debt service, everything pays off faster. Perfect world. The other way we sometimes see things is, okay, there's no CID or TIF, or everything's still expiring in year 23, but the city or another party agrees to provide some credit enhancement. They voluntarily say, if TIF revenues don't meet the projection, I'm going to come out of my own pocket, I'm going to pay a little bit extra.
Mercy.
That also provides coverage, because now you've got an investor that says, okay, if the TIF doesn't work, I've got the city and those things together, I'll less risk for me, so I'm going to bid a lower interest rate. Well, again, that all works great in theory. Sometimes in practice it works great. Sometimes it means that if projections really don't meet it, you end up in a situation where the city does come out of pocket. And that's only in the sort of independent scenario where they voluntarily agree to that. It's not the case with most TIF bonds.
When you're dealing with a bond, is the city's responsibility to go out, put the bond out there to bid, or is it the developer's responsibility to put it out there for bid?
So in a typical scenario, the city would engage an underwriter. Common underwriters in Missouri are Stiefel Nicholas, Piper Martin now, Stern Brothers. They would market the bonds to their investors. They would underwrite the bonds. The city, or if you formed an industrial development authority, would be the issuer, basically working as a conduit. TIF revenues come in by state law, they go out for bond payments. We're not responsible for the actual payment, we're just facilitating that flow of money. And then you will see, just similar to if you issued any other municipal bond, there are some sort of annual reporting requirements. And often when we structure the TIF bond deals, a lot of the annual reporting, not a lot, some of the annual reporting requirements might be more in the developer's purview. So then we contractually require the developer to assist in those. So a typical TIF bond annual report might say, item 1, how much pilots did the city collect this year? Item 2, how much eats did the city collect this year? Item 3, list all tenants in the shopping center. Well, item 1 and item 2, the city can do pretty easily. Item 3, we're going to contractually require the developer to provide us that information.
Anyone else? All right.
Thank you very much. I'll be happy to stick around a few minutes if anybody wants to come up to me afterward.
Thank you very much. Meeting's adjourned.